Greetings. Welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, based goddess supreme, and I am here recording with a beautiful, sparkling white tea with pomegranate juice from Trader Hosen. And I'm here sitting in an office. I am babysitting a beautiful dog. He is a husky. His name is Yukon, and he's an old man. And I am sitting here excited. I am so fucking excited. Why am I excited? Because today, I am going to cover one of the most fascinating subject matters, in my opinion. This, to me, is I don't even have fucking words. I am so excited. So today, I am covering Jinn, or, as many people know them by in the Western world, genie. Jinn refers to the class of supernatural beings with magical powers that we in the US/Western world call genie. However, fun fact, the term jinn is actually the masculine version or plural version of these beings, where a female would be a jinni. And so when we say genie, we're actually saying the feminized version. And a lot of the depictions of what jinn are in the Western world have been bastardized and altered, mainly because the tales of the 1001 Nights, or in the West, they're often known by the 1001 Arabian Nights, became famous in the West because a French author translated a lot of these stories and changed the stories so that they would appeal more to European audiences and also not offend them, because they were very culturally different. There are certain things in those stories that this author felt would be offended by, and so he altered the stories quite a bit. So a lot of the stories that we know about, I think the most famous one that comes to my mind is the story of Aladdin and the genie. That story has been so greatly bastardized to appeal specifically to European audiences. And over time, those stories have become a part of our zeitgeist and understanding. However, Jinn, the concept of Jinn, has been around for longer than you could imagine and is so fascinating. So let's get right in. Jinn are fire beings born with something known as fitra, which is purity and innocence. It is a natural constitution. They are beings created from smokeless fire. Jinn are considered neither good nor evil. There are believers and non-believers. The etymology of jinn has a Semitic root. So the word jinn, or jan, means to hide or conceal. They are known as beings concealed from the senses, which we'll get more into it, but for a lot of humans, they are naked to the visible eye, and they will only be visible if they choose to be. So the word jinn is also related to the word majnun, which means possessed or insane. Now, there's also a word jannah, which means garden or heaven. The word janeen means embryo. The word Janaea is Aramaic for garden or deity. And Jaina, Jani is Persian for a wicked female spirit. So those are just a bunch of words that have very similar sounds and roots to the word jinn. But the tale of jinn is recorded in the Quran, and their ancestors are known to be Jinn. So before I continue, jinn is spelled Jinn. John is spelled Jann. Oh my gosh, Janabelle, that's me. So the Jinn are descended from Al-Jinn, which is an angelic tribe that lived in Jannah, which is the heavenly garden. The Jinn are considered to be the ancestors of the Jinn in the Quran, and they inhabited Earth 2,000 years before Adam. The king of the Jinn was known as Jinn ibn Jinn. The etymology of Jinn is to hide, or it refers to agile snakes. They are known as creatures of fire, and allegedly Jinn ibn Jinn, the king of Jinn, was known to have been the builder of the pyramids. The story goes that the Jinn offended the heavens and angels, and they were sent to fight. Oh wait, I phrase that confusingly. The story goes that they offended the heavens and God, and that the angels were sent to fight the Jinn, Iblis being the leader of these angels. The Sunni mystic Ibn Arabi says that Jinn is the original source of animal power. The inferior of a human animal soul, hidden from senses, were demoted after being cast from heaven. So, in this story, the Jinn were the original inhabitants of heaven and rulers of earth. And again, what I found interesting is that the etymology also sometimes refers to agile snakes, which kind of makes me think of the Leviathan, which is the primordial serpent that inhabited planet Earth before humanity. It also reminds me of the Nagas, which are the primordial serpent beings of Buddhism and Hinduism that inhabited the earth before humans. And that just means we're going to have to do episodes about those. I was thinking about doing episodes of it all together, but we don't have time. I think it's better to focus on one topic at a time. But just know, my chaotic brain is just thinking about so many things at once. This is so fucking interesting. So, according to the Sunni mystic Ibn Arabi, the one who claimed that the Jinn have the origin of animal powers, says that the power of illusion is the strongest of animal powers, and he believes that the power of illusion is a trait inherited by the Jinn. So, the Jinn are not considered immortal. They are lower than gods, but they have direct effect on humans. They are known to have influence on soothsayers, philosophers, and poets. And in pre-Islamic cultures, jinn were believed to be the leaders of humanity. Because they were more powerful than humans, they are associated with incredible titles and often feared. But because they are not immortal, it is possible to kill a jinn as a human. Some believe that they are actually responsible for mental illness. So there's talk in the Quran that if you have a weak mind, a jinn could actually take over your mind and make you think things and act in ways that are not yourself. And these would all be accredited to jinn influencing you. It was believed that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was sent not only as a prophet to human, but also a prophet to jinn. So jinn, even though they are a different race from humans, are thought to be in the same area of judgment. We all have the ability to be judged by God or Allah. Jinn are thought to be nature spirits. King Solomon, the famous king written about in the Bible, was known to be able to speak with plants and animals and jinn, both good and bad jinn. King Solomon allegedly built the first temple to combat rebellious jinn and devils. And he was known to be educated in ancient magic and specifically Egyptian magic, and had the ability to create sigils and seals to be able to imprison jinn in vases or any type of container. And that's why there actually is a lot of stories from this part of the world that have jinn that are enclosed in like urns, in lamps, in pitchers with a magical seal on them that keeps them imprisoned. And that is a piece of the story of Aladdin or Aladdin. The idea being that this jinn is actually, with the use of Solomon's magic, was imprisoned into this container because they were, quote, bad. Part of the morality and the idea of a good jinn or a bad jinn is the difference between being a believer and non-believer. So the idea that a jinn that was a Muslim or believed in God was to be a good jinn, they had good morality, whereas one that was a non-believer was considered to be bad because they were flexible to sin and to exploiting living beings. They are known to eat, drink, procreate, die, and they are subject to heaven or hell because they are able to sin. The jinn were created from the fires of Samum, which is a primordial fire mixture that isn't actually, from what I understand, not real fire. It's like an energetic fire because they are made from a smokeless fire, which my little brain is thinking about the burning bush in the story of is that Moses? Am I not mistaken? There's this bush of this energetic fire that's talking to him, and that makes me think of jinn. Jinn are the children of smokeless fire. So what if Moses was speaking with a jinn? Who's to say? I don't know. So, the belief of the creation story was that Wednesday, angels were created. Thursday, jinn were created. And Friday, humans were created. So jinn are, I guess, the middle point between angels and humans. They're not quite fully energy, they're not quite fully physical. They are a transient midpoint. Jinn are prosperous until they become corrupt and unjust. God sent angels to combat them, and only a few were left, and the remaining population fled to far islands, deserts, and mountains. So they are specifically associated with deserts, islands, and mountains in very remote places because they were exiled from heaven. Islam gave them a second chance, and especially after the Prophet Muhammad had an open mind to letting, if they were believers in Islam, an open mind to their existence and didn't fear them. But they were thought to envy humans and wanted their place and ranking on earth. So there is this connotation with jinn that they are constantly envious of humans and God's favor to them. So, like I mentioned, jinn are known to possess humans. So, not only mentally, but they are also known to spiritually possess humans. If a human is weak in any way, insecure, mentally unstable, if they are unhappy or have a broken heart or are possessed, it is possible, they believe, for a jinn to possess them. And what I find so fascinating about that is that they basically, in Islam, they believe all possession of any kind is actually the work of jinn. Now, here is what blew my mind. Allegedly, there is thought to be a civilization of jinn which are known to live underground below the city of Bethlehem, and it's known as Artas. The reason why I find this so interesting is because, like I mentioned earlier, one of the synonyms of the etymology of jinn, or of John, I should say, is serpent or snake. And it reminds me of the stories of both the Naga from Asia and the Leviathan in the Bible, of this primordial serpent moving underground. And in the Tales of the Thousand and One Nights, there is actually a story of a man who falls in love with this woman, and she is controlled by a jinn that lives underground and comes up to spy on her and imprisons her in this beautiful garden, but she cannot leave. And this jinn can travel through time and space, but comes out of portals from under the earth. So that's just my mind reeling. It is thought that when jinn either enslave humans, infect them, or possess them, or kill them, it's often out of jealousy. They are known to fear iron. That really gets my mind reeling. So what I find so interesting about this is that there are so many folk tales and fairy tales from around the world talking about how these supernatural beings strongly dislike iron. And I actually did look this up, and it is actually really from all around the world. And one interesting idea that was presented was that iron was an allegory for modernization, and the more modernization moved forward, people lost belief in these supernatural beings. However, another really interesting little tidbit I found was an excerpt from the Bible, and it's Judges 1:19, and apparently this little excerpt says, "And the Lord was with Judah, and he drave, I think drove, but it says drave. He drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots made of iron." And I guess iron was associated with being man-made and very physically real, because it not only has iron but a mixture of other metal alloys. So I guess the idea being iron is so anchored in the physical world that anything that was too energetic, enigmatic, did not have physical shape. Iron was too solid for them to manipulate. So that's one idea, which I found very compelling, and it's so interesting because, again, part of why I'm so fascinated with jinn is I actually hear almost all other entities from around the world that are, fairies come to mind, just like other entities that are known to be invisible or shape-shifting or magical in any way. Jinn kind of seems to be an umbrella that checks a lot of those boxes of tales from all over the planet. So, anyway, often jinn are depicted in humanoid forms. So they are like bipedal, upright walking beings, but they're often depicted having horns and often depicted with black skin. Now, I wonder, they are said to be from a smokeless fire, so, I'll take that. But there's another part of me that is like wondering, well, first, it kind of actually reminds me of the depictions of the devil in a lot of Christian literature and scriptures and, illustrations of the devil. But also, it does remind me a little bit of how racism has existed for so long, and darker skin is often demonized and associated with like living underground and hell. I wonder if hell is really hell, or if hell is just the underworld, if you will, or like being dirty. I don't know. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions if that specific fact is sensationalized or not. It is a common belief that human witches use jinn as a means to do magic and fool humans who cannot see jinn, which is, quote, like the whispers of Satan. Okay, so like I mentioned, non-believing jinn are known to be bad, and so that they're actually classified as demons. For a while, in ancient areas of the Arabic Empire, humans were actually given the death penalty for talking or dealing with jinn, and this was done in an effect to stop sorcery. So, as the story goes, people like soothsayers, fortune tellers, or even people who were trying to make money doing magic tricks were known to summon jinn using payments with such things like magical objects, talisman, things like jewels. They would try to enslave jinn by using iron pins and or iron shackles that they could not remove. There's also other stories of people using seals, the seals of Solomon, but a lot of the stories I've read where people were actually using the seals of Solomon, they most often tried to hide or bury the object they hid them in. So let's say they put them in a chest and sealed the chest. They would often throw them into an ocean or a lake or hide them underground so that no one would find them. So because jinn they live so long compared to a human life, they can see the past and the future. So part of why fortune tellers would use them is because jinn would be able to give them so much more information. So it wasn't, in fact, magic. These soothsayers would actually telepathically communicate with jinn and thus get information to fool other humans if they had magical powers. So, King Solomon apparently summoned the jinn king, known as Fiktush, and he asked him to bring forth 70, in some stories, or 72 jinn responsible for diseases and ailments to receive remedies. During this time, this marked the beginning of the era and belief that some jinn were to be ever locked away, imprisoned. And so this marked the beginning of King Solomon starting to use magic to seal jinn into containers and casting them out to sea or hiding them somewhere. Technically, even though King Solomon was doing magic, it was considered licit magic because it was based in purity, whereas illicit magic was based in disbelief in Allah. So there was this man known as Al-Tabas who lived way back in the day, and he wrote a book called Shamil, which was a magic manual that was used to gain power over jinn using charms and spells. According to him, there were 7 kings of jinn that were associated with the 7 days of the week. For Sunday, the king was known as Al-Mudib. Monday, Murrah al-Abaid Abu al-Harith. Tuesday, Abu Mihris al-Amar. Wednesday, Barkan Abu al-Ajab. Thursday, Samhurish. Friday Abu Hassan Zobah, and Saturday Abu Numaimun. The pronunciation is not guaranteed to be correct. This actually, I I love reading about these stories because I I read The Tale of the Thousand and One Nights a couple years back, and since then I've read different translations. And I love reading stories about jinn that were imprisoned. And so basically, I grew up watching Aladdin, and I don't know, that movie didn't really do it for me, but I ended up reading the story of Aladdin. And it was way longer, so much longer than the movie, and very different. And one of the things that really fascinated me was the story of the jinn. The jinn in the story of Aladdin that I read was imprisoned inside of a lamp. And he was imprisoned because he was a non-believer of Allah and was put there by King Solomon with a magical seal. And so the reason why he wasn't in the book wasn't given 3 wishes. He was given unlimited wishes because he took the lamp. And funny enough, in the story, Jafar, who I do not believe that was his name in the story, but we can call him Jafar. He was a magician and had received a prophecy that there was only one man on earth that would be more powerful than him. And the man at that point, when the soothsayer gave him this information, was named Aladdin, and that's all he was given. So the story begins with the character that we think of as Jafar traveling throughout Asia and stumbles upon a village in China where he ends up meeting a boy named Aladdin. And that's when he literally is on this quest to find this boy so that he can kill him. And so he cons his mom, cons Aladdin, pretends to be this long-lost uncle because his dad was dead. And in the story, Aladdin was like a pretty naughty boy who wasn't going to school, and his mom had a business he wasn't helping with, and he was literally just like doing petty theft and hanging out with his buddies. And Jafar ends up conning his mom and conning him to think that he was going to inherit this great fortune, and convinced him to go out into the desert, and similar to the movie, has him go out and, buries him in the sand. And he ends up finding this treasure trove and ends up finding this lamp that has a jinn in it. And Jafar had no idea that there was in fact a jinn living down there, and thus the story begins. I can go on forever, but there's actually other stories in the Tales of the Thousand and One Nights of similar things happening, of fishermen fishing in the ocean and finding a chest that has the seal on it, and having a jinn inside trying to bargain for their freedom, and the jinn's pleading and pleading and pleading for freedom for them to come out. There's other stories of people traveling through the desert and stopping at a well to get water, and lo and behold, the well is actually inhabited by a great jinn. One of my favorite stories of all time is about this story is a long one, and it's hard to abridge because in the Tales of the Thousand and One Nights, the idea is that there's a princess who is bargaining for her life by telling such interesting stories that her husband, the king, won't behead her because he's too interested in hearing more. And so she keeps feeding him fascinating stories, one after another, and he just is so interested to know what happens that he decides to let her live. And my favorite story is a story of a porter, and it ends up being a story that leads into a story that leads into a story that leads into a story. And it's there's multiple jinn that show up in this tale, but my favorite jinn encounter in that story is told by a prince. And in the story there's actually 3 princes that end up meeting, and all of them had lost their crown. They were all exiled from their country. They all, through different turns of fate, lost their left eye, I believe, and all ended up having to shave their heads and beards, which in Islamic culture, especially back in the day, was not traditional. Men were always growing their beards long and growing their hair long. So through this turn of fate, these three exiled princes end up meeting on the same night and end up at this bizarre gathering in this group of sisters' house. And it turns out that these sisters have dogs that are actually their other sisters who are turned into dogs by another set of jinn. Blah, 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 blah. But one of the princes tells his story. And in one part of his story, he actually encounters a jinn because he has sex with this woman. I actually mentioned a piece of this story. There was a woman who was living in a garden, and he discovers this garden underground, and it's full of rubies and jewels, and it's the most beautiful garden he's ever seen, which also reminds me that the word Jannah, which is where the word John comes from, means garden. Anyway, he ends up having sex with her and living with her, and she says, you have to leave every month because this jinn has enslaved me, and he every month comes back to have sex with me. And he ends up falling so deeply in love with this woman that he decides to confront the jinn against this woman's wishes. So what happens? The jinn shows up. He's like, this is my girlfriend now. I love her. And the jinn is like, you fool. So he murders the woman in front of him and then turns the prince into an ape. And as his story progresses, he ends up getting a job on basically a pirate ship as a scribe, because they're hiring a scribe for this ship. It's not quite a pirate ship. I think it was like a pretty well-to-do ship that was importing and exporting goods, and they were hiring a scribe to be writing out their invoices. And this ape, who was actually a prince, obviously was literate. He could read and write in the most beautiful handwriting, and so he interviewed for the job, and they entertained this ape for fun, but it turns out he had the best penmanship. So he ended up becoming the companion of the sea captain. They were playing chess together. He was reading and writing, and so he became this novelty. Eventually, they end up landing in a city, in a great kingdom, and it turns out that the king of this kingdom was also looking for a scribe. So the sea captain, out of great pride, brings his prized ape to this king. And of course, the king is delighted and amazed by this ape, and eventually invites his daughter to come view the ape. And his daughter immediately looks at the ape and she says, Father, this is not an ape. This is a man. He is a prince, and he has been enchanted by a jinn. And the king says to his daughter, how do you know these things? How can you tell? And she admits, she says, Father, my nursemaid growing up was an Egyptian sorceress. And from the time I was born, she has been training me in the ways of magic. And it turns into this battle where this princess battles this great jinn, and it's this shape-shifting battle where they keep changing their forms, and it results in both of them dying, which that was like the most abridged version of the story I could tell, because it's literally hundreds of pages long, and this prince's story is a fraction of this overall tale that is weaving together. But what gets me about that story is, one, the princess in my mind should be the main character. The princess was like a fleeting character that gets a mere few pages during this epic battle with Jinn. And I want to know her life story. I want to follow her life training with an Egyptian nursemaid about all things sorcery in order to battle this primordial Jinn. But anyway, blah, 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 blah. I'm thinking about these things because even in these ancient stories, a lot of the methods that the stories are saying that people are using actually come from Egyptian mysticism. And apparently Solomon, and even in these stories that were passed down orally and eventually written down, that Egyptian magic was being employed to suppress them and battle them. And if you've listened to the episode about the Coptic people, sadly, most of the information that we once had on ancient Egyptian culture has been destroyed and erased through centuries and centuries of colonization from multiple cultures from around the world. And basically, my mind is just going a million directions at once. Actually, before I continue, there's another piece of that story I mentioned that just popped into my mind, has some relevance. So in the same story that I was mentioning about the three princes, the story really revolves around three sisters. And the story begins with a porter. You know, the porter's someone who carries items for a living. This porter is in a market, and this beautiful woman hires him to carry all of her groceries that she's getting. And she's getting all the most expensive things, and she's this beautiful woman, and she ends up taking him to her home, which is this gorgeous tiled pavilion. And he's just so amazed by how beautiful these sisters are. And he ends up staying for dinner. And it just so happens that these three princes knock and end up coming in because they hear such beautiful music and talking, and they need a place to stay. And then eventually the caliph, or the king, ends up showing up because he's in disguise as a local, and he's looking to crash a party and hears all this talking happening. So it turns into this like huge banquet of men observing these three beautiful sisters. But what ends up happening is the sisters do this. It's such a dumb tactic, but they say, okay, we need to do something. You can watch, but you can't ask any questions. And they bring out two dogs and whip them. And they repeat, like, you can't ask us why we do this, but we're going to whip our dogs in front of you. So naturally, these men are like, why are you whipping these dogs? And so it turns into this whole thing. And that's... To skip forwards, eventually you find out why they whip their dogs. And the reason why they whip their dogs is because these dogs are actually their sisters that were turned into dogs by a Jinn, a genie, actually, a female Jinn. And these sisters were punished by the Jinn and turned into dogs. And the Jinns told them that if they did not whip them once a day, that she would have them killed. So the reason why this all happened was because basically these two sisters really fucked over their younger sister. Their younger sister was very generous with them. She helped them, and through a series of fate, they just really fucked her over, and they marooned her on an island while they were sailing to a different city. So while she's marooned on this island, this younger sister is crying and crying and crying, and she looks up and she sees this tiny little snake being chased by a massive, huge snake. And she jumps back, she freaks out, and she feels bad for this tiny snake that she can tell is like really running for its life. So she picks up a huge rock and she drops it on the head of this massive snake. And the little snake ends up sprouting little angel wings and flies away. And then she takes a nap and she wakes up, and there's a beautiful woman rubbing her feet. And this woman says, I am a Jinn. And I was that little snake you saw. I was in snake form, but you saved me. This giant, powerful Jinn has been chasing me for years and years and years and was so close to killing me. But you saved me, so I'm indebted to you. And because this Jinn could see all the things that had happened to this girl, she wanted to kill her sisters. And this girl pled and pled and pled that her her sisters were not killed, and so the Jinn decided to turn them into dogs, and her compromise was that they had to be whipped every day. Anyway, what I find so interesting about these stories is that these Jinn seem to be more similar to humans than I think a lot of us believe. They have the need for revenge, the need to be loyal, the need to repay. Some of them are, quote, evil, some of them are nice. But what I find so interesting about this particular story is that the Jinn were in the form of snakes. And I promise I'm going to cover Naga and Leviathan because there's a lot of overlap here with these primordial powerful beings having their primary form be snake. And I think that's the only story I've read where they actually appear in snake form. But like I mentioned, the etymology of the word Jinn is snake. So anyway, that is my very long side tangent. I just love talking about Jinn. And let's make more stories about women dealing with female Jinn, because it's not news that every story, or almost every story that is famous, is usually written by men about men, and women are side characters. And why can't we make more stories with female sorcerers dealing with female Jinn doing dope shit? Because anyway, no. I'm not gonna go down this tangent, but just saying. So, where was I? I was talking about the 7 kings of Jinn, and I was talking about sorcerers and whatnot. Yes, okay, so here's another fascinating fact. Apparently, sleep paralysis is attributed to Jinn. Apparently, if you experience sleep paralysis, the Quran will tell you that it's actually an attack by a Jinn. But what I find so interesting about this is that I've actually heard some people say that when they experience sleep paralysis, they kind of see smoke-like shadow beings, which kind of checks out because they are known to be smoke beings. Jinn are known to be 90% spirit and 10% flesh. So, okay, so this is like a very odd little tidbit I found. But apparently, along with the Jinn and / Jan, there was actually a series of other supernatural beings known as the Hin, Bin, Tim, and Rim. And apparently the Hin fought alongside the angels that were fighting against the Jinn. They were similar to Jinn, but they were actually made out of different elements. So the Hin were actually dog-like beings that were made out of fire, and they were associated with air. Bin were actually water beings. So apparently there's actually like cousins of Jinn that are known to have fought against the Jinn. So I guess they still inhabit the sky and the gardens of heaven. But this actually does remind me a lot of different stories from Asia of these spirit dogs that are known to guard temples and whatnot. But anyway, back to Jinn. So there are zoomorphic Jinn. So there are actually animal Jinn. They're often depicted as scorpions, cats, owls, donkeys, or black dogs, which are considered Hin, and serpents. Ding, 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 ding. According to some legends, when you kill a Jinn, they revert either back to scorpion form or snake form. Just saying. Wolves are known to be the predators of Jinn. The word Jan can mean either Jinn or serpent, like I mentioned. And because of that, a lot of people actually fear killing snakes out of fear that they're killing Jinn. And by killing a Jinn, they'd be afraid that members of that jinn's family would actually want to avenge their death. Which actually reminds me of that little story I told of the female genie being chased by this giant serpent, and they were actually jinn in serpent form. So, another really interesting fact, which I had never heard of, is that there are certain animals that are associated with being the vehicles of jinn. So apparently gazelle, fox, dogs, and ostriches are actually known to, I guess jinn are known to ride them. The other thing that's really interesting is because they're associated with cloud and smoke, a lot of people, when they see formless clouds or smoke, they think that it's jinn. They're also associated with wind and mist and storm. And a sandstorm is considered to be a battle of jinn. What? So there's also anthropomorphic jinn, which are jinn that actually lack true form. And when they materialize, they choose human form with animal characteristics, often with wings, claws, horns, etc. So here is some little tidbits that I accumulated that are beliefs written in the Quran. What's interesting about the jinn is that the Quran does mention them, but there's also a lot of oral tradition and stories over time that has circulated. So there is this interesting conglomeration of their folklore and the belief around them. But according to the Quran, Allah, or God, gave jinn powers to test them, and that they are actually held accountable for oppressing others with them. So essentially the powers are a great test from God to see how they use them. And the idea is that with more power comes more responsibility. So by abusing their power, they, I guess, receive a more intense punishment. So according to the Quran, human possession happens for a multitude of reasons. And I did mention some of them before, like weakness of either emotional weakness or mental weakness. But like I was touching on a second ago, a big reason why jinn are known to possess humans is actually to get revenge on that human or that human's family. Another one is actually falling in love with a human. And jinns are actually known to possess humans to try to sway the human to fall in love with the jinn. Another one is because they are, quote, purely wicked. So, it is actually believed that jinn can be exorcised by calling upon Allah and Allah alone. It is believed that if one person was to call upon a different angel or entity, the jinn would oblige simply to have them abandon the sole worship of Allah. Almost basically to like trick someone into praising someone other than God. And then afterwards, the jinn will return knowing that no one but God can keep it from oppressing others. So essentially, the Quran states that jinn take pride and fun in tricking people out of worshiping God, and in doing so are entertained, but will actually return to possess that person unless the person, basically they can only be successfully exorcised with the word of God. But apparently, jinn can also possess animals, plants, and objects as a ploy to have people worship others besides God. And like I mentioned, magicians and soothsayers are thought to make deals with them and in assistance for, appearing powerful. One of the other things I forgot to mention is that apparently like jinn, because they can travel between the realms, they can actually go to heaven and eavesdrop on angels' conversations and relay the information to soothsayers. The story goes that after the Prophet Muhammad came to be, that the angels in heaven became more guarded. I don't know. That stories like this always interest me because from what I understand from angels, they're not humans. They're like bizarre, like Lovecraftian energy creatures that have no form, but if they did, they'd be like dark beings covered in eyes. You know what? I should do an episode on angels on one day of like the stories of angels versus like the actual biblical descriptions of them. That would be really interesting. So apparently, fun fact, shooting stars are thought to be demon jinn being chased out of heaven for eavesdropping. Ah! It is also thought that when magicians or soothsayers are using jinn, they actually use a middleman, if you will, known as the Kareen. So the Kareen is actually a companion to jinn, and every human is actually assigned one. And I guess at birth, I wonder if you were to, assuming, well, actually, I don't know if the Quran talks about rebirth or multiple lives, but I wonder if you were to be reincarnated, if you were to have the same Kareen. But essentially, your Kareen is it's like a relative to the jinn, but it's like this entity or guide, if you will, that follows you around that you're connected with, and you can actually have your Kareen talk to jinn, and then your Kareen will talk to you, because a lot of people don't actually have the ability to even talk to jinn. So your Kareen is actually doing all the work for you, and it constantly whispers to your base desires and tries to divert you from righteousness. So in the Quran, essentially, the Kareen is not thought to be virtuous. Natural human form is believed to be virtuous according to the Quran, and your Kareen is trying to sway you from your natural virtuous being, according to the Quran. Apparently, by being able to talk to other people's Kareens, you would also be able to tell their fortune. So that would be a way to not actually necessarily use jinn, but to be able to communicate with your own Kareen and have it communicates with other Kareens. So another interesting thing that I read was that if you were seeing deities, ghosts, any kind of being, like let's say you had a dream of a prophet or a god, that is actually thought to be the work of jinn, and jinn are known to try to have you worship anything other than God, to try to, I guess, like bring you into the realm of sinners. I actually found this really funny. I don't want to say funny, but I found this really entertaining article that was talking about famous magicians that use jinn, and I found this a pretty incredible article that was essentially hating on David Copperfield, and was like, David Copperfield uses jinn. And yeah, I don't know, David Copperfield, if you're listening, I would love to interview you. I'd love to ask you a bunch of questions. I mean, you probably won't give up your secrets, but I would love to see your response if I asked you if you use jinn to achieve magic. Because, who am I to judge? I'm not here to judge. I'm here to observe and report. But a reminder, just like humans, they're neither good nor bad. It's all up to personal choice. And that's actually what I really appreciated about the Quran's take on jinn. It was actually very, in some moments it felt judgmental, but overall it was non-judgmental, because at the core belief is that at birth they are all equal in the eyes of God. They have the ability to be good or bad, and it's all based on their personal decisions, which I think is a very powerful sentiment, because I would love it if, as humans, we steered away from making generalizations. Oh, they are a deer and deers are mean. Whatever. That's an example. I'm just saying, judging a person, an individual, any form of life based off of our experience of what we think they are is not fair. I think everything on earth is shaped by personal choice and then shaped by the things around it. Obviously, there's other things that could contribute to somebody or something doing things that we perceive as evil. We all have to take ownership over our own choices, but also recognize that we are being influenced all the time. But I think that that's a very powerful sentiment, to treat all things as equal and that we are all being shaped by our own decisions. So jinn are not considered good or evil, but individuals that make individual decisions, and I'm with it. I'd actually, reading up on this makes me want to reread the Tales of the Thousand and One Nights. So I've read different translations, but the best translation I've read is a Penguin Classic, and let me actually look it up now, because the translation was made by a man that grew up, I believe, in Iran. I don't want to get it wrong, but he grew up speaking Arabic, and then ended up becoming, I think he went to Oxford and studied English linguistics and studied Arabic linguistics. And so he did an amazing job translating this book by keeping it true to the original wording. But because he actually writes this beautiful intro in the beginning, that the story is written in very old Arabic, so if he translated it too literally, I mean, it would be like pretty hard to read, because it would be like reading an old English. So he did an amazing job updating the English so it feels like you're hearing someone just saying it to you. And he even had the ability to, in certain parts, make certain things rhyme. And so it's amazing. I think that the one I'm talking about, it's called Tales of the Thousand and One Nights, Penguin Classics, and the cover has a couple cuddling under a little blanket. And this book changed my life. It's some of the best storytelling, and even more than storytelling, I mean, it's fucking brutal. One of the first scenes in the book is an orgy followed by a man murdering his wife because she's having an orgy with her slaves and her nursemaids. But what captivated me in this story, in this book, was making me realize that it's so easy to remove your life from the rest of humanity. But things haven't been that different ever. I mean, it's always been brutal on Earth. People have always been having sex. Inebriation, money, corruption, like all these things are not new. And my grandma always tells me this, but when I read this book, it really sunk in for me, because these stories are thousands of years old. And again, I mean, of course, they were told orally. So over time, they're slightly changed and people are adding their own flair to whatever these stories are. But my grandma always used to tell me, Annabelle, every generation believes that they invented sex. And when she told me that as a kid, I didn't totally understand what she meant. But the older I get and like reading that, I really understand what my grandma was talking about, because it's not just sex, it's like everything. War, genocide, hatred, love, like all of these human emotions and like crazy, horrible, sometimes beautiful, chaotic things that happen on planet Earth. It all feels new because, we're experiencing it for the first time, but all these things have been happening forever. And I think what I appreciated so much about the Tales of the Thousand and One Nights is that I feel like a lot of other stories that I was told of different parts of the world, they're always edited, they're always watered down. Like I said, when the Tales of the Thousand and One Nights was actually first translated, it was first translated into French, and the man who translated it totally changed everything because there was a lot of sexual assault, there's slavery. I mean, there's a really intense story about a slave who's actually from Africa, and the story of how he was castrated. I mean, it's fucked up. But, this guy who translated it into French felt like European audiences would be too offended by a lot of the talk of genitals and sex and all these things. So he completely changed the stories. And the story of Aladdin that Disney told is pretty close to what this French man redesigned. And reading this raw translation is so... It was exhilarating for me because it made me feel like I was time traveling. It made me feel like I was stepping in an alternate time. And it's so cool. One of the coolest stories is the story of Sinbad, the sailor, the 7 journeys of Sinbad. And, maybe I'll do an episode where I actually summarize that story just because it's a really cool story and I love it. But now, alas, I am rambling. I'm excited. I'm exhilarated. I love talking about Jinn. If you have experienced sleep paralysis, if you've met a Jinn, if you have stories from your family about Jinn, if you know things that I did not cover, please write me an email at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. If you have a subject that you would like me to cover, please send me an email. You can follow me on Instagram at esotericaandnonsense. You can follow me on TikTok at esotericaandnonsense. I'm so grateful that you listened to this podcast, that you listened to this episode, that you made it through. I am blessed. You are blessed. Have a beautiful day, and you'll hear from me on the next episode. Cheers.